Okay, we'll start then. Bismillah. If everybody's here. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Nabina Muhammad ibn Abdullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. أما بعد إخوتي الكرام أخواتي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today inshallah we'll be speaking about an important topic for people today, especially the youth, which is the issue of halal gender interaction and how to navigate the context regarding that. So once again, I want to keep my dars short and maybe keep a lot of time for questions, inshallah. So I'm only going to take a few minutes to give some general principles. I think that's the best way to really understand this topic. And then we'll open up the floor for Q&A, bismillah. So first, there are two types of interaction in Islam, two major types of interaction that we can maybe explain and define. The first thing is what we call al-khalwa. And the second is what we call al-ikhtilat. So these are the two different terms, and they mean two different things that can be problematic, of course, but they don't have to be depending on the context and situation. So first, what is the meaning of khalwa? And we'll go into these terms more, precisely. But if I were to give a general definition, what is the meaning? What does it translate to? What does khalwa mean? Khalwa means isolation. So this is the first major point to keep in mind: isolating oneself with the opposite gender. Okay, so this is the major critical point, or the first major critical point, which is khalwa, isolating oneself with the opposite gender. And we'll speak about what that means. And the second major point is what we call al-ikhtilat. Al-ikhtilat means free mixing. So this is the second major critical point. Free mixing. So there's a difference. Sometimes people, they mix between the two, or they don't differentiate. There is a difference between khalwa and ikhtilat, even though generally the principles are the same and the rules are the same, generally. So now that we understand these 2 points, ikhtilat and khalwa, isolation and free mixing, you'll realize that this pretty much governs gender interaction in history and even today. So today, in general, either you're going to be isolated with the opposite gender, or you're going to be free mixing with the opposite gender in terms of what is haram, or what is problematic, or makruh, or not recommended, and so on and so forth. As for gender interactions that are outside of these two categories, then they are generally halal because, of course, when we say isolation and free mixing with opposite gender, this excludes close family members, maharim. So this excludes, this does not include the mahram. So everything other than that will be a halal interaction for different reasons. Maybe it will be with your mahram, so you are doing khalwa with your mahram, a mother with her son, or a daughter with her father, or a brother and sister, or husband and wife. This is opposite gender, but here this is mahram context, of course. So here you might be isolated, or you might be free mixing with family members, such as your father, your brother, your sister, blah blah blah, etc., etc. When you're with the opposite gender that's not mahram, either you're going to be isolated, or either you're going to be free mixing. Now let's speak about what all of this means. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, what does all of this mean? So first let's speak about khalwa. Okay, let's speak first about isolation. Now, is every type of isolation with the opposite gender haram? The ulama in general, they say there is what we call a khalwa muharrama and a khalwa jaiza. So there are two types of isolation, two types of khalwa. There is a haram khalwa and a halal khalwa, meaning a halal isolation and a haram isolation with the opposite gender. Okay, so that's the first point. What is the halal khalwa? So if you understand the halal khalwa, you will understand what the haram khalwa is. Okay. The haram khalwa, okay, like pay attention to this. The ulama mentioned the haram khalwa is isolation with the opposite gender in a place which is private, in a place in which people will have to knock on the door to enter. Okay? In a place in which people don't see you and you don't there is no fear of somebody else entering. Why? Because the place is private. And people need permission to enter that place. This is the haram type of isolation. Some scholars add to this as well a place in which nobody can hear you, or nobody can have a chance of hearing you if they come close. So meaning it's completely private. Now, this is what the ulama mentioned as a haram khalwa. And we have, for example, the fatwa of Ibn Nujaym, one of the great classical scholars. He says, إن كان لا يدخل عليهما أحد إلا بإذن فهي خلوة. If two people of the opposite gender are together and nobody can enter upon them, or nobody can enter their space apart by permission or except by permission, then this is khalwa, and this is the haram type of khalwa. Okay. As for the halal type of khalwa, the halal isolation is the one in which this isolation is public. People can see you, people can hear you, or they have a chance of hearing you if they come close. And also, you are not, you are not in a private place where people need permission to enter upon you. And an example of this is when a woman from the Ansar came to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him for a favor or she had a question, she had a need or something like this. But it seemed to be something that she didn't want other people to hear, like more of like a private conversation. That she didn't want to be in front of everybody. So she asked to be isolated with the Prophet ﷺ. But look at this type of isolation. Where did they isolate themselves? In public, okay, next to the road or next to the street, the main street in Medina, where people pass. So they weren't in the main, let's say they weren't in the middle of people, but they just went to the side where there are less people, where they can have a more private conversation. Yet they are still in public, and yet people can come to them if they want to join the conversation and so on. There's still that possibility. It would have been haram khalwa if they had been in a room with each other and so on, and nobody could enter without knocking on the door, for example. So the Prophet ﷺ, he did this. He went to the side with this lady and, took her complaint. And this also shows the humility of the Prophet ﷺ, that he was approachable, and that people, they could speak to him, and if they had needs or questions, that they could approach him, and he was accessible to them. Knowing that he is the Prophet, he is the ruler, the leader, he is basically like the king, the Khalifa. That is the political role that he has, on top of the religious role But that shows the humility of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's regarding khalwa. As for and of course, if we want more evidence of this, hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, if the mahram is present in a private setting, then this is not khalwa anymore. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in the hadith, لا يخلون رجل بامرأة إلا ومعها ذو محرم. That no man should isolate himself with a woman except that she has a mahram. That's narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. And in another hadith, very famous, لا يخلون رجل بامرأة إلا كان ثالثهما الشيطان. Narrated by Tirmidhi. That no man should isolate himself with a woman except, or rather, no man isolates himself with a woman except that the third of them is shaitan. That's very, very famous. Meaning that they're completely isolated. And this shows the reason why khalwa is haram, this type of khalwa, because it leads to fitna. And it can lead to zina. So it's a doorway to zina. As for al-ikhtilat, free mixing, then free mixing has the exact same concept. We have two types of free mixing. Al-ikhtilat al-muharram, haram free mixing, and al-ikhtilat al-jaiz. Al-ikhtilat al-jaiz, which is the halal type of free mixing. What is the difference? Okay. The difference is, so how do we define the haram or the halal rather type of free mixing? To put it simply and to put it generally, halal free mixing is when men and women get together in one area. Okay? In one area, but by following the Sharia rulings and the Sharia guidelines. This is the halal type of free mixing. Some scholars also say this is the murib free mixing. So you have free mixing murib and ghair murib. They also give this categorization. The doubtful free mixing and the non-doubtful free mixing. So the haram free mixing or the doubtful free mixing, or rather the halal free mixing and the non-doubtful free mixing is when men and women gather together in one area but following the Sharia guidelines. Such as, for example, the masjid. Do men and women are not men and women in the same place at the masjid? At the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this enters the definition of free mixing in the sense that men and women are in the same place, in the same area. However, here they follow Sharia guidelines. In the masjid's context, in the masjid's setting. Which is what? Which is there is a separation and there is a different entrance or a different exit. So that there is no mingling. Which leads us to the haram type of free mixing. The haram type of free mixing, also called the doubtful free mixing, meaning that it's doubtful. So nobody goes to the masjid and there's men and women at the masjid, and nobody thinks that this is doubtful, that this can lead to zina, right? However, there are other settings where, yes, this is very doubtful, and this can clearly lead to zina, or this can lead to haram that can lead to zina, or this is a doorway to zina. Which is simply put, men and women gathering together in one area without following the Sharia guidelines. Okay, so of course, we might not have time to really go through all of the Sharia guidelines when it comes to this. But general guidelines, for example, are linked to, for example, touching. Okay, so when there is a touching between men and women, this is problematic. This is haram between two opposite gender, non-mahram. When women are without sufficient covering, like they don't have hijab, or even men for that matter. So it's possible that men also don't cover their aura. This type of free mixing is problematic and can lead to zina or open up the doors that lead to zina. Also, guidelines in general that are linked to free mixing. It's an important principle to remember that all of this is meant to avoid fitna. So anytime you think that there's a possible fitna, or the moment you realize that there is a fitna, or if you feel in a situation of fitna, then, and this can vary from person to person or context to context, then it's upon you to close that door and exit or leave or whatever the case may be. The second principle as well is intention. If you feel you have incorrect intention in a gathering and that you're not going to follow the Sharia guidelines, then of course here as well is problematic. And the third principle is cordiality, to keep cordial. Cordiality, to keep cordial, meaning with the opposite gender in a free mixing context. And even in these are the same principles goes for isolation, for khalwa, that you keep things cordial between the opposite sex, or with the opposite sex rather. Meaning, there's not like joking and laughing, and because who are we kidding? This opens the door to zina and fitna and so on, right? People wonder why there's like cheating and adultery, and why husbands cheat on wives and wives cheat on husbands. What do you guys think it comes from? Like, you think it just pops out of nowhere? You think from one minute to the next it just happens? No, there are what we call muqaddimat. Muqaddimat meaning that there are, quote unquote appetizers that lead to this. There's introductions that lead to adultery. These are the introductions and appetizers, right, that lead to adultery. So cordiality as well is important. So everything we've said here, and of course, just really quickly, the scholars they mentioned this as well. I think it's pretty clear. A lot of Muslims, they don't differentiate between a doubtful or non-doubtful setting of free mixing. So I'll have brothers and sisters or I'll come up to them and be like, what's the ruling on being in a classroom, for example? I want to study Islam, but I'm in a classroom, at my institute, and in my institute, it's a class and there's men and women in the same class. How does that work? If in the class Sharia guidelines are being followed, what's the problem? And this is why the great scholar Taqiyuddin al-Hilali from the last century, he said there's two types of free mixing. It's clear. Can you say that the free mixing in a classroom of religious studies is the same as a free mixing at the cinema or at the theaters? I think it's pretty clear, or in the dance floor, or at the club. Right? It's pretty clear. Like, a lot of people mix between this, and they're like, "No, I'm not going to let my sister or my daughter go study in the class. There's men there." In that case, she can do nothing because, at some point there's going to be men. If she goes to the market, there's men, and so on and so forth. But the important thing here is to follow the Sharia guidelines and to not enter into any what we call doubtful free mixing. So, with that being said, everything we've mentioned here can be transferred to online interaction. Okay? Keep in mind that everything we've mentioned here as well can be changed, or the ruling can be changed based on need and necessity. So if there is a necessity, if there's a need, if there's a particular circumstance, the ruling can be different. So, for example, for medical reasons, it is allowed, for medical necessities rather, it is allowed for a man and a woman to be isolated for medical necessity, such as a woman needing an operation or vice versa. And then, there's no female doctor or there's no male doctor, whatever the case may be, right? So everything we've mentioned is also under the guidelines or under the exception of possible necessity. So the same goes for online interaction. There can be a need sometimes for a brother to message a sister or a sister to message a brother. And this is isolation because, um, some scholars say that this is not the isolation that is forbidden, because there will, because there needs to be presence, physical presence, for that isolation to be forbidden. However, they say it's still forbidden due to the temptation and the fitna and so on. But there can be need for that if you keep it cordial, if you keep it quick, you get to the point. Then, inshallah, there's no problem with that. If there is no need for it, then it's better to have a third person. And in fact, the ulama say that breaking the isolation is by adding a third person, a third party. That way, the third party won't be the shaitan, as in the hadith. And this is the opinion of Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, and other scholars. So the same goes for online interaction, for WhatsApp groups, for Discord, and so on and so forth. And remember, the more it's public, the more it's cordial, the more the intentions are correct, and the more fitna is avoided, then all of that will be responding to the Sharia guidelines, inshallah. So I'll end here. I don't want to make my talk too long, and also I do have to go in a short while, so I do want to make questions possible. So inshallah, I'll open up the floor for Q&A, and I'll end by saying أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله ولي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Okay, so questions are opened up. So go ahead, inshallah, if you have any questions. Okay. Let's see what we have here in terms of questions. Sister asks, what if by mistake a man touches my hand at work? Anything done by mistake is not sinful. So like we said, intention. So if something is not done by mistake, or sorry, if something is done by mistake, then this is not sinful, because the Prophet ﷺ said, إن الله وضع عن أمتي الخطأ والنسيان وما استكره عليه. That Allah has forgiven for my ummah their mistakes, their forgetfulness, and the things that they were forced to do. But of course, if that was intentional, then that's another question or another response. Okay, brother asks, if a woman does not have a wali, what is the right way to ask her about marriage? Jazakallah khairan. It would be good for the woman to appoint somebody as her wali, whether that be the imam of a masjid. Now remember, when we say appoint her as a wali, that doesn't mean forever. It means for a particular interaction or for a marriage context. That doesn't mean that that person is her mahram or her wali forever. It just means that he can represent her in certain situations where she needs representing, such as marriage. So she can try to appoint a wali, such as a masjid, an imam of a masjid, or an Islamic representative, if possible. If not, it can be a good Muslim brother who is trustworthy, that she trusts. And if not, then the woman can be spoken to directly. So I didn't mention, but when it comes to marriage and the inquiring about marriage and engagement, the rules are a little bit relaxed. as in the fatwa of many of the scholars, such as Ibn Baz and others. So the rules are a bit more relaxed, even though the general Sharia guidelines are still in place, because, of course, that is not your mahram. So you know, until that person is your mahram, the rules are the same. However, they're a bit more lax and there is a little bit more forgiving in the Sharia regarding that. So, you know, she has not appointed a wali for herself, then she can be spoken to directly. But once again, it should be cordial. It should be straight to the point. No time should be wasted, and of course, it should be serious conversation with no joking, laughter, so on and so forth. What if a female teacher is only tutoring me at my home? This is not allowed, as in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that even for teaching of the Quran, there should be no isolation. So here what you would need to do is have a third party to break the isolation. So have a third person present in the tutoring. I have a question, Shaykh. Can a woman be considered a third party mahram between a woman and a man who intend to marry? Or does it have to be a man? To clarify, a daughter with her mother and a non-mahram enters the place of khala where they are. Is this permissible? Naam, this is permissible according to some scholars. Many scholars allow the isolation to be broken by a third party. The third party can be a woman. Naam. So for example, in Shafi'i fiqh, Hashiyatul Jamal says, يجوز خلوة رجل بامرأتين ثقتين. That it is allowed for a man to be isolated with two trustworthy women. And Ibn Abidin, he says, الذي تحصل من هذا أن الخلوة محرمة تنتفي بالحائل ووجود محرم أو امرأة ثقة قادرة. So it says the khalwa can be broken by the presence of a mahram or another trustworthy woman. نعم. So I hope that's clear, inshallah. So this is the major principle, by the way, but of course, if there's a situation of fitna, remember, fitna can always change the ruling or the principle. So this is the main ruling, the main original principle. If there's extra fitna due to a certain context, then the ruling can change. Never forget the spirit of the law. Okay, the spirit. Why are these things in place? So don't get lost in the rulings and forget the spirit or the objective of these rulings. Now, brother asks, the interactions with the opposite gender due to needing something, but you'll be in contact with the opposite gender due to that need. For example, you need to make an appointment, but by phone you have the opposite gender to make the appointment. Or seeking work by phone, they ask you more questions, and they're also if the person interviewing you is the opposite gender. Naam. Once again, this is for, I mean, depends on the context, but this, well, let's say it's for a need. Okay, you need a job and so on. And you have to speak to opposite gender over the phone. Then, like I said, this goes back to the Sharia guidelines. So first of all, this is not isolation, and this is not free mixing. Why is it not isolation? Because over the phone, okay, people can see you, and people can enter upon you, and there is no privacy really. And what I would suggest, what's even better, is to use loudspeaker. Okay, but people can hear you anyway. So if you start speaking in a certain way, people around you will hear you. Okay? Let's say you're isolated and there's nobody with you at home. Then if there's a need, okay, if there is a need, then keep it cordial, follow the Sharia guidelines, keep your intention clean, and don't open the doors of fitna. And also keep it limited, keep the interaction limited. So the objective should be fulfilled without going any further. But brother asks now, the third person who is also a Muslim into our online chat. This is the last question. Yes, this can be done if there's a need for it. So once again, if there's a need, if there's no fitna, then isolation can be broken with a third party, whether it's a brother or a sister. No. But if there's a context of fitna, then the ruling changes. What if your female friends have guy friends and they all want to hang out together and invite you? Should you go or avoid this? This should be avoided because this sounds like doubtful. This sounds like a doubtful free mixing, where Sharia guidelines will not be followed. No. The brother asked, Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh, is it permissible to have a small smile while interacting in real life when there is a need to, or I should avoid it? Sometimes this should be avoided, but sometimes this is natural. So as long as the intention is pure and there's a general cordiality. So, you know, if the interaction is cordial in general, if 99% cordial and there's 1% smile that slipped, then this is not problematic, inshallah. Because this was natural and maybe it was not really intentional, and there was no bad intention behind that, or no haram intention behind that. But if this becomes like a lot, okay, if this becomes like a lot, or if this is like constant throughout the interaction, this is problematic because this opens up the door of fitna. Now, but in general, you know, we should have what we call, with the opposite gender, you don't have to be mean or have like a mean face. You can have like a regular smile, not an excessive smile, but like a regular smile. Just like a regular good face. This is not a problem. The Prophet ﷺ, there is no indication that the Prophet ﷺ in his interaction with the opposite gender had like a mean face or was like, you know, had an angry face or something like this. However, there is no extra smile, no excessive smile, just a regular good face. Why? Because this is not doubtful. Excessive and extra smiles, of course, this enters into the realm of doubt because this opens up the door of fitna. So I hope that's clear, inshallah ta'ala. Keeping in mind that the Prophet ﷺ generally had a good face and was known to be a positive person, and in his interactions and the way he dealt with people. I'll take a last round of questions, and inshallah we'll end the dars. Now, keep in mind, brothers and sisters, a lot of our talk today was about what's permissible, what's not permissible, the definitions of interactions. But keep in mind that whoever wishes to go the extra mile in avoiding fitna, then that is commendable. That is rewarded. Okay? So whoever, just because we say something is permissible doesn't mean it should be done, or doesn't mean it's a good idea to do it, or doesn't mean we recommend it. So I just want to lay that out as well, that if anybody wants to go the extra mile, so we should respect people that want to go the extra mile to avoid fitna. So if, for example, a brother or a sister, they don't accept personal messages from opposite gender on their social media account and stuff like that, then we should not criticize that. In fact, we should commend that. Now, whether it's permissible or not permissible, this is maybe another conversation. But we should commend that and we should value that. Because there's nothing wrong with going the extra mile in avoiding fitna and protecting oneself. So make sure to understand the difference between discussing what is permissible or not and between what we call al-wara'. Al-wara' means going the extra mile in piety, which is what many of the Salaf used to do. I see there are no more questions. So I think we can end here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan to all. Appreciate it. And forgive me today for the delay. And see you in the next one, inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu fikum jami'an. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.